In the autumn of 1873, in a settlement called Greycreek on the edge of Dakota Territory, a widow pulled the first stone from a half-frozen creek. She did not know it then, but in 5 months that stone would help bury one man, save two others, and force an entire town to its knees. She did not know that the wall she was about to raise would outlive her neighbors, outlive the iron stoves. They laughed at her for refusing. She only knew that her husband was dead, that her hands were strong, and that the wind on this prairie had nothing to stop it but what she built herself. Her name was Hattie Brennan. She was 42 years old, with shoulders squared by years behind a plow team and a jaw set the way certain women set their jaws when the only thing left to grieve with is work. She arrived in Greycreek alone on a wagon she drove herself, with one mule and a single oak trunk strapped down behind the seat. The trunk was unusually heavy. Inside it lay the tools of a stonemason, a leather-bound notebook with brittle pages, and the last quiet inheritance of a man named Silas Brennan, who had died of fever in Iowa 3 years earlier without ever building the home he had promised her. She bought 80 acres at the northern edge of the settlement, the parcel no one else wanted. The land sat exposed to the open prairie, no trees to break the wind, no rise of ground to soften a storm. The man at the land office took her money slowly, the way a man takes money from someone he believes is paying for her own funeral. He counted twice. He looked up at her each time. She did not look back. Outside, the autumn light was thin and yellow, the kind of light that warns a person about winter without giving any details. Hattie walked her mule down the main road of Greycreek and did not look into the windows of the small frame houses, did not nod at the women who pretended not to watch her from behind glass. She had been a stranger before. She would be one again. The general store smelled of cedar smoke and tobacco and the dust of dried beans. Hattie counted out coin for flour, lard, coffee, and a length of iron hinge. She was halfway through her tally when the door opened behind her and a man stepped inside with the heavy, unhurried walk of someone who answers to no one in the room. He removed his hat in a single clean motion when he saw her. "Ma'am." He was tall, lean gray at the temples. A tarnished star sat on his coat. Marshal Daniel Aldridge, 55 years old, formerly of the Union Army, currently the only law for 40 miles in any direction. "The land you bought," he said, quiet enough that the storekeeper had to lean in to hear. "My brother died on it in '68. Winter took him. You watch yourself." Hattie tucked the last coin against her palm. She looked at the marshal for a long moment, longer than was polite, the way a woman looks at a man when she is deciding whether to keep his words or set them down. "Then I'll build for him too," she said. The marshal did not answer at first. Something passed behind his eyes that she did not try to name. He fitted his hat back on his head, touched the brim, and left without buying anything. It was at that moment that the laughter began. 3 men stood near the back wall of the store. They had been pretending to look at saw blades. The tallest of them, a wide-shouldered farmer in his late 30s with a coat too thin for the season, leaned against a barrel and spoke at the volume men use when they want a stranger to hear, without admitting that they spoke to her. "She's worked hard," he said, "to make herself cold this winter." The 2 men beside him snorted. They turned away as if it had been a joke for their own private audience. Hattie did not turn her head. She paid the storekeeper. She lifted her sack of flour with both arms and walked toward the door. The man with the wide shoulders shifted to let her pass slow enough to make the small kindness feel like an insult. Behind her, the bell above the door had not finished ringing when Marshal Aldridge stepped back inside. He had been waiting on the porch. He walked straight to the farmer and stopped a single pace away, close enough that the man could feel the marshal's breath on his collarbone. "Holcomb," the marshal said. His voice did not rise. "Your wife has been dead 11 months. Show some grace." Wesley Holcomb did not answer. He looked at the floorboards. The other two men became very interested in the saw blades they had been pretending to study. Marshall Aldridge did not wait for an apology. He turned and walked back out into the autumn light, and the bell above the door rang twice the way a bell rings when someone has finished saying what they came to say. It was the first time another man had corrected Wesley Holcomb to his face in 11 months. The shape of it stayed in him long after he could explain why. That night, in a one-room cabin she had bought, standing Hattie Brennan lit a single tallow candle and knelt on the packed earth floor. She unfastened the leather straps on the oak trunk. She lifted the lid. The hinges groaned the way old hinges do, the way they had groaned in another cabin in another year, when another hand had laid the same things inside. Stonemason chisels, a mason square, 3 small mallets of different weights, a folded leather apron soft from years of grease and dust, and beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound notebook with brittle pages and a faded inscription on the inside cover. Pennsylvania, 1856. What old man Schreiber taught me about heat and stone. Silas had been 17 years old when he wrote that line. He had been apprenticed for 2 years to a German immigrant named Heinrich Schreiber, a stonemason from Bavaria, who had carried with him across the Atlantic the memory of a kind of hearth they did not build in America. A hearth made of stone instead of iron. A hearth that did not heat the air. A hearth that heated the wall around it and let the wall give the heat back slow all night while the fire slept. Silas had drawn diagrams. He had measured flue lengths. He had figured out in the steady, careful hand of a young man who believed he had time exactly how to build such a thing for the wife he had not yet married. The last page bore a sketch of a small cabin with a stone wall thick along the east side, an alcove carved into it, and the words for Hattie written underneath. He had died of fever before he laid a single stone. She closed the notebook. She closed the trunk. She blew out the candle. She did not weep because she had finished weeping for Silas in the 2nd year, and now she had only the work he had left her. The work was the grief made useful. The work was the only way she knew how to keep him alive. The next morning she walked half a mile west to the creek and began pulling stone from the bed. The work was brutal. Limestone is heavy, and the creek bottom was cold enough by mid-September that her hands went numb inside the first hour. She chose flat pieces where she could find them, the broad shelf stones that broke clean along their bedding planes. She rolled them up the bank one at a time, levered them onto a low wooden sledge, and dragged the sledge back to the cabin behind the mule. Each trip took most of an hour. She made 4 trips a day, her shoulders bruised, her palms split and scabbed and split again. By the end of the first week, the skin on her hands had turned the color of old saddle leather, and she had built no wall at all, only a pile of stones taller than her head behind the cabin. It was on the 8th day that the old man came. He arrived without announcement on foot, leading no horse. He wore a leather apron blackened by years of forge work and a hat that had been new sometime before the war. His beard was the color of pewter, and his hands, when he held them out in greeting, were the hands of a man who has done one kind of work for 50 years and no other. "Pritchard," he said, "Ned Pritchard. I do the blacksmithing." He was 70 years old, give or take a year, and he did not ask permission before he walked over to the stone pile and laid his palm flat against the top piece. He stood there a long moment. He turned each of the upper stones in his hand the way another man might turn an apple to find the best side. Then he looked at Hattie, and his eyes had something in them she had not expected. It was not curiosity, it was recognition. "My father built one of these in Vermont," he said, "when I was a boy. We called it the Soul Stone. Wasn't fashionable then either." Hattie set down the stone she had been carrying. She wiped her hands on her apron. "What happened to it?" "My father died. My mother sold the farm. The man who bought it tore the wall out for the iron stove, said the cabin felt haunted with all that rock in it. Old Ned smiled with one side of his mouth. Some men can't sleep next to anything older than they are. He did not stay long. He turned to leave, and at the edge of the yard he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "They'll fight you, Brennan," he said. "They fought my father too. Stone offends men who burn wood for a living." He walked back across the prairie toward the settlement, and Hattie watched him until he was a small, dark figure against the yellow grass, and then she went back to the wall. But something inside her had shifted. The work she was doing was older than her grief, older than Silas, older than the country she stood in. It had a name. It had a memory in another man's mouth. She was not alone in the lineage of this wall, even if she was alone in the building of it. By the end of September, she had begun to lay courses. She set the largest stones at the base the way Silas had drawn them. She mixed clay and sand in a wooden trough with her bare hands, working in horsehair from the mane of her mule, working it until the mortar held together like woven cloth and would not crumble between her fingers. She built slowly. She built precisely. The wall rose along the eastern side of the cabin, thick at the bottom, narrower at the top, with a small firebox set into the center of its face and a flue path that ran upward and then sideways through the body of the stone before it climbed to the chimney. The firebox opening was small, much smaller than the cast iron stoves that sat in every other cabin in Greycreek. It looked to anyone who walked past like the mouth of something that could not possibly keep a person warm. The neighbors began to walk past. They came one at a time at first on errands they invented. A woman bringing back a borrowed pot Hattie had never lent her. A man asking if she had seen a stray heifer that had not strayed. They stood in the yard and they watched. They tapped the lower stones with their knuckles. One of them muttered behind his hand to another, "That's firewood turned into a grave." Hattie did not answer. She kept laying stone. It was on a Tuesday in early October that Mabel Crowder came. Mabel was 55 years, the widow of a Union officer who had died at Cold Harbor and the only midwife within 20 miles. She had brought every child in Greycreek into the world for the last decade, and she had buried more of them than she liked to count. She walked into Hattie's yard carrying an iron pot wrapped in a flour sack, and she did not stop to watch the wall. She walked straight up to Hattie and held out the pot. "Venison," she said. "I made too much. You're not eating enough." Hattie wiped her hands again. She took the pot. Mabel sat down on an overturned crate at the edge of the work, and she did not speak for a long time. She watched Hattie set 3 more stones. She watched the way Hattie's hands knew where each stone belonged before her eyes confirmed it. "Where'd you learn this, Brennan?" Mabel asked at last. Hattie did not look up. "My husband knew a man who knew stone." Mabel nodded slowly as if she had been expecting that answer or one very much like it. She rose from the crate. She did not press. She walked back across the prairie the way she had come, and the empty flour sack hung from her wrist like a small white flag. Hattie ate the venison that night. It was the first meal in 3 weeks she had not cooked herself. 2 days later, Ezra Whitfield came. He came with his son. Ezra was 50 years old, broad through the chest, with a graying mustache and the careful manners of a man who has learned that politeness opens more doors than anger. He was the only wood merchant in Greycreek, and for the last 12 winters, he had earned the bulk of his year's income in the 4 cold months between November and March. 3 cords per cabin, 30 cabins a price, he said himself, because no one else hauled timber from the eastern stand of pine. He fed his wife and 3 daughters on that ledger. He was not a cruel man. He was a man whose entire life was held up by a single arrangement, and he had come to Hattie's yard because he had heard in the way news travels in a settlement that small that the widow at the northern edge had ordered only 1 cord of hardwood from the back lot of the general store, and had paid in advance and had told the clerk she would not be needing more. He removed his hat as he came up the path. His son walked behind him, a thin boy of 14, with dark hair and eyes that took in too much. "Mrs. Brennan," Hattie set down her trowel. "Mr. Whitfield, ma'am, when winter hits, you'll need 3 cords, maybe 4 given the wind on this stretch. I can deliver Tuesday." "I'll need 1, maybe less." Ezra smiled the way a man smiles when he is trying to be kind to someone he believes is mistaken. "Then you'll freeze, ma'am, respectfully. I appreciate the warning." She picked up her trowel. She turned back to the wall. The dismissal was complete, and Ezra felt it like a cold draft along the back of his neck. He stood for another moment, hat in his hand, and then he set it back on his head with a small, precise gesture and turned to go. "Toby," he said, "come on." The boy did not move at once. He had taken 2 steps closer to the wall while his father spoke, and now he was reaching out with one hand toward a section of mortar that had not yet dried. "Pa," he said, "why does this feel like braided rope inside?" Ezra stopped walking. Hattie turned her head. She looked at the boy for the first time, really looked at him, and what she saw there made her set down her trowel a second time. The boy had felt the horsehair in the mortar. He had felt it without being told what it was. He had felt the weave of it, the way a person feels the grain in a piece of wood without having to look. "You've got good hands, boy," Hattie said. Toby flushed. His father called him again, sharper this time, and the boy hurried away down the path. But in the bend in the road, he looked back over his shoulder, and Hattie was still watching him, and something passed between them that neither of them named. He would carry it the rest of the winter. That Sunday, Hattie walked into Greycreek for the church service. She had not planned to attend. She did not believe in the comfort of preaching, and the long benches inside the small, frame chapel were known to be cold even in October. But Mabel Crowder had stopped by the cabin on Saturday afternoon and had said in the casual way Mabel said everything that mattered, "The Reverend's been talking about you, Brennan. You might want to hear what he says when you're in the room." So Hattie went. She sat in the back pew. She wore the gray wool dress she had brought with her from Iowa, the one she had not worn since the funeral. The pews filled. People nodded to one another. Wesley Holcomb came in last and sat 3 rows ahead of her without looking back. Reverend Hollister Pike was 60 years old. He had been a Methodist circuit rider in his youth and had ridden the prairie for 15 years before his knees gave out, and the congregation at Greycreek built him a chapel he would not have to leave. He was a thin man, white-haired, with a voice that had carried over open ground for 2 decades and had not lost its reach. He stood up in the pulpit that morning and he looked straight at Hattie Brennan in the back pew, and he did not look anywhere else for the entire sermon. "There is a natural order to a home," he said. "A hearth at the heart of the room, a bed for rest, a wife for the husband, a husband for the wife, children at the table. When a soul builds outside that order, when a soul takes the stones of the earth and stacks them where the bed should be, that soul invites the wind in. The wind is not only weather. The wind is the cold breath of pride, the cold breath of a creature who believes she has learned what her elders did not know." He spoke for 40 minutes. Hattie did not move. Her hands lay folded in her lap. She did not look at the floor, and she did not look up at the rafters. She looked straight at Reverend Hollister Pike, and she let him say every word. When the service ended, the congregation rose. They did not look at her. They filed out into the autumn light with the careful blankness of people who have been instructed in what to think and have decided to obey without admitting it. Hattie was the last to rise. She walked out the door, and at the bottom of the chapel steps, Reverend Pike was already standing greeting the families as they left the way he greeted them every Sunday. Marshal Daniel Aldridge was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He had not been inside the chapel. He stood with his hat in his hands and his back to the road, and as Hattie came down the steps, he turned and walked beside her, close enough to be deliberate. "Reverend," the marshal said loud enough for half the congregation to hear, "my brother froze in this country, cold and stars in a clear sky. If a wall keeps a soul warm, I don't care if it offends your sermon." Reverend Hattie's face went red along the bones of his cheeks. He did not answer. He turned to greet the next family in line and pretended he had not heard. Hattie did not thank the marshal. She walked beside him to the road, and there she stopped, and she turned to him and she said only, "Why?" The marshal put his hat back on his head. "Because my brother is buried in your 80 acres, he said. "And because I have watched men freeze for 20 years in this country, ma'am, and I have not yet seen one of them saved by a sermon." He nodded to her once. He walked away toward the small log building that served as his office, and Hattie stood in the road and watched him go. The first snow came on the 15th of November. It came without warning, a hard, fast fall that began in the middle of the night and did not stop until the prairie was white from horizon to horizon. The temperature dropped to 15 below by the second night. The wind came off the open ground with nothing to slow it, and it pushed itself under doors and through the seams of log walls and into the lungs of every soul in Greycreek who had not yet finished caulking for the winter. In the cabins of the settlement, the pattern was the same. Iron stoves were stoked high at dusk. The rooms grew hot, almost stifling in the hour before bed. Then the family slept, and around 3 in the morning the heat slipped away. The walls let it go. The air let it go. By dawn there was frost on the inside of the window glass and a thin skin of ice on the water bucket. And the children stayed wrapped in blankets until someone struck flint and got the fire roaring again. In Hattie Brennan's cabin, the pattern was different. She fed the firebox at 6 in the evening. She used hardwood split, fine stacked tight inside the small opening, 3 hours of hot, clean flame. The fire did not roar. It drew. The flame was pulled inward and upward through the long flue inside the wall, and the heat passed not into the air of the cabin, but into the body of the stone. She let it burn down without tending it. By 9 o'clock, the chimney had stopped smoking. By 10, the firebox held only coals. By midnight, the coals were gray. The wall did not cool. She slept inside the alcove she had cut into the eastern side of the stone, 60 inches long, just deep enough to lie inside with a panel of pine fitted on iron hinges that closed flush against the frame. From the room, it looked like a pantry door. From inside the alcove, it felt like being held inside a body that was breathing slowly and warmly and would not stop until morning. On the third morning of the cold stretch, 2 men walked across the prairie before sunrise. They told each other they were checking on her. They walked through snow that came up to the tops of their boots, and the wind on the open ground cut their faces raw. One of them was Wesley Holcomb. The other was a neighbor named Caleb Morrow. They did not knock at the door of the cabin when they arrived. They stood in the yard and they looked at the chimney. No smoke. They glanced at each other. Caleb pushed the door open without speaking. He stepped inside first, and Wesley followed, and they both stood for a long moment in the doorway, with the cold air of the prairie at their backs and the air of the cabin in front of them. The air of the cabin was not cold. It was not hot either. It was even. It did not bite the lungs. It did not sit heavy at the floor. It hung in the room the way the air hangs in a room where a body has been sleeping all night. Wesley walked to the wall. He pressed his palm flat against the limestone. He did not pull it away. The stone gave warmth back into his skin. Not blazing, not hot, steady the way the side of a horse gives warmth when you lean against it in a stable. He turned his head toward the small pine panel set into the eastern face of the wall, and from inside the panel, Hattie's voice came quiet, unhurried. "Give it a moment. The hinge creaked. The panel opened. A breath of warmer air drifted into the room, and Hattie sat upright inside the wall, her hair loose around her shoulders, a wool blanket folded at her feet. Behind her, the stone still held the night. She looked at the two men in her doorway, and neither of them laughed, and neither of them spoke. Caleb Morrow took off his hat. He did it slowly, the way a man takes off his hat when he has walked into a room he did not expect to be a room. Hattie stepped down from the alcove. Her bare feet touched the packed earth floor, and the earth was cool but not frozen. She closed the pine panel gently behind her. The wall kept breathing warmth into the cabin. The fire had been dead for 8 hours. The two men did not stay long. They mumbled something about checking on the road, about looking in on the Pritchard place. They left without finishing whatever they had come to say. Caleb walked straight back to his own cabin and did not speak of the wall to his wife for 2 days. Wesley walked back across the prairie the long way, the way that took him past his own south fence line, and he stopped at the corner of the fence, and he stood there in the snow for almost an hour. In December of 1872, 11 months before his wife Adelaide had died of pneumonia in a cabin he had kept burning all night. He had stoked the iron stove every hour. The room had been hot. Her hands had been cold. She had died with her hand in his at 4 o'clock in the morning, and her fingers had been the temperature of river stones. He had not been able to understand it. He had blamed himself for not stoking hotter, for not getting up sooner, for not bringing in more wood. He had spent 11 months convinced that he had failed her by not feeding the fire enough. Standing at the fence corner in the snow, with his palms still warm from a stone wall a half-mile away, he understood for the first time that he had been asking the wrong question for 11 months. He could have stoked that iron stove for 100 years, and the air would have done what air does. It would have lifted the warmth and given it to the rafters and let her hands stay cold. He walked home. He sat down in the chair Adelaide used to sit in. He cried for the first time in 11 months. He cried without sound because crying without sound was the only kind of crying he had ever learned. And when he was finished, he was hollowed out and quiet and changed. 3 miles south at the back room of the general store, Ezra Whitfield was listening to Caleb Morrow tell the story of the wall. Caleb told it badly, the way men tell stories when they do not want to seem affected by them. He said the room had been warm. He said the fire had been out. He said the widow had been sleeping inside the wall like a child in a cradle. The men around the stove laughed, but the laughter was thin and short, and one of them said after a pause, "Well, how long was the fire out?" "Fire out." 8 hours, Caleb said. "Maybe more. Chimney was cold to the touch." The room went quiet. Ezra Whitfield set his coffee cup down on the counter very carefully. His face did not change, but his son Toby, who was sitting in the corner with a piece of harness leather he had been pretending to oil, looked up at his father, and what he saw on his father's face he had never seen before. He saw fear. Ezra leaned toward the storekeeper. He said low enough that the other men did not catch it, "If everyone builds walls like hers, who buys my wood?" Toby looked down at the harness leather. His hands had gone still. That night, Marshal Daniel Aldrich crossed the prairie alone on foot, with a small flask of whiskey inside his coat. He did not bring a lantern. The moon was 3/4 full, and the snow gave back enough light to walk by. He arrived at Hattie Brennan's cabin a little after 9 o'clock. The chimney was already dark. He did not knock. He stood at the door and called her name once quietly, and she opened the door and stepped outside without asking why he had come. He sat down at the small pine table. He set the flask on the table between them. He did not speak for a long time, and Hattie did not press him. She brought 2 tin cups from the shelf. She poured for them both. The whiskey was warm in the mouth and smoky on the way down, and the wall behind her shoulders gave its steady heat into the room. "My brother died on the night of a clear sky," Marshall Aldrich said at last. "Cold and stars. He was 24 years old. He had a good rifle and a bad cabin and 3 cords of wood that lasted him until February." Hattie did not answer. She turned her cup in her hands. "If you keep building," the marshal said, "I'll keep watching the road." She looked at him. He looked at her. Two people in late middle age who had each buried the wrong person sitting at a small pine table in the second winter of a settlement that did not yet know what it was about to learn. She did not thank him. She lifted the flask and poured him a second cup. Outside, the wind was beginning to rise again, and somewhere across the snow, Wesley Holcomb sat in a chair that had once been his wife's, and somewhere else, Ezra Whitfield lay awake counting cords of wood in his head and finding the numbers wrong. And somewhere else, Reverend Hollister Pike read the same passage of Ecclesiastes 3 times without absorbing a word of it. And somewhere else, a 14-year-old boy named Tobias Whitfield lay on his back in the dark and thought about the way a piece of mortar could feel like braided rope inside. The wall did not cool. The settlement did not yet know what was happening to it, but the cold had only just begun, and the wall had only just begun its work. And by the time the winter ended, 4 men in Greycreek would be lying awake at night because of what one widow had built along the eastern side of a one-room cabin. One of them would understand. One of them would be afraid. One of them would hate her for it. And one of them would remember 50 years late what his father had taught him about heat and stone. By the last week of November, 4 men in Greycreek were not sleeping. One of them lay awake because he had finally understood something. One because he was afraid. One because he hated the woman at the northern edge of the settlement for the change she had brought into his life without asking. And one because he had remembered 50 years late what his father had taught him about heat and stone. Wesley Holcomb was the first to come back. He came on the 6th evening of the cold stretch, in the early dark with a lantern in his hand and a question shaped like a brass ring in his pocket. He had not slept properly in 5 nights. He had stood at his fence corner in the cold 3 more times. He had walked the perimeter of his own cabin and counted the seams in the log walls. He had pressed his palm against his own iron stove an hour after dampening it and had felt it go cold under his hand inside of 20 minutes. He crossed the snow to Hattie's door, and he raised his fist to knock, and she opened it before he had touched the wood. "Wes!" "Hattie." She stepped aside. He came in. He did not take off his coat at first. He stood in the middle of the room with his lantern still lit, looking at the wall, the way a man looks at a thing he has been thinking about every hour of every day for nearly a week and has not yet been able to name. She closed the door. She did not invite him to sit. She walked to the firebox and she knelt, and she began to lay the fire the way she always laid it. He watched her do it. He watched her hands choose each piece of split oak by weight before her eyes confirmed the choice. He watched her tuck the smaller pieces low. He watched her work the way he had once watched his own father shoe a horse, with the kind of attention that does not blink. She struck the flint. The fire caught. The flame drew up into the body of the wall the way it always drew. Here, pulled inward, pulled upward, pulled into the long path inside the stone. She stood. She turned to him. "Sit down, Wes." He sat. He set the lantern on the table and turned the wick down. He took off his coat. He laid both his hands flat on the pine, and from his inner pocket he drew out a small object wrapped in a soft cloth, and he set it on the table between them. He did not unwrap it. He looked at it for a long time before he spoke. "My wife Adelaide," he said, "she died in December of last year, pneumonia. I burned the iron stove for 40 straight hours. I never let it go below a roar. The room was so hot, the candles softened. Her hands were cold when she died. They were the temperature of river stones. Hattie poured him a cup of coffee. She set it in front of him. She did not sit yet. "I have spent 11 months," Wesley said, "believing I killed her by not stoking hot enough. I have spent 11 months convinced that if I had brought in one more cord, fed one more split, sat up one more hour, she would have lived." He raised his eyes to the wall. The fire was drawing clean and small inside the firebox. "Tell me what I did wrong, Hattie. I have to know." Hattie pulled out this bench opposite him. She sat down. She looked at the small, wrapped object between his hands. She did not answer his question. She looked at the fire for almost a full minute before she spoke, and when she spoke, she said only this: "The air carries heat. It cannot keep it. Stone keeps." Wesley did not move. He sat with his hands on the table, and he turned the sentence in his mind the way a man turns a found object in the light. "The air carries heat. It cannot keep it. Stone keeps." The words rearranged something in him that had been broken for nearly a year. He understood all at once that he had not killed Adelaide. He had only been given the wrong tool. He had been given an iron stove and 100 years of his father's fathers telling him that the iron stove was the answer, and he had used it the way they had taught him, and the room had been hot, and Adelaide had still died, and it had not been his hands that failed her. It had been the entire instrument. He put his face in his palms. He did not cry this time. He had cried at the fence corner 6 nights before, and that crying had been the kind a man does once and never again about the same thing. What he did now was something quieter. He sat with his face in his hands for 2 full minutes, and Hattie did not move and did not speak, and when he lifted his head, his eyes were dry and his jaw was set, and he picked up the cup of coffee and drank it down to the bottom in 3 long swallows. "All right," he said. He set the cup down. He looked across the table at her. "Tell me about him," he said, "the man who taught you." Hattie did not answer right away. She rose from the bench. She crossed to the oak trunk in the corner of the cabin. She knelt. She lifted the lid. From under the leather apron, she drew out the notebook with its brittle pages. She carried it back to the table. She laid it down between them. She did not open it. Her hand rested on the cover. "Silas Brennan," she said. "He was my husband for 14 years. He was apprenticed at 17 to a German mason in Pennsylvania, a man named Heinrich Schreiber. He learned this from him. He spent 10 years drawing the plans for this cabin. He drew it for me. He died of fever in Iowa 3 years ago in the spring, 2 months before he was going to break ground." She did not say his name twice. She said it once, and the saying of it cost her something. Wesley saw the one. He did not look away. "He was a good man?" Wesley asked. "He was a quiet man," Hattie said. "He was the kind of man who came home with his hands torn up from work and would not let me bandage them because he did not want to ruin a piece of cloth. He laughed once a month. He read 3 books in his life and remembered every page. He loved me more than air." She stopped. Her hand was still on the notebook. Her thumb moved along the brittle edge of the cover. "I loved him more than stone," she said. "Stone is just what's left." Wesley reached across the table. He did not touch her hand. He laid his own hand flat beside hers, a few inches apart, not asking for anything. "All right, Hattie," he said. The fire burned low in the firebox. The wall behind her shoulders gave its quiet heat into the room. They sat at the pine table for another hour without speaking, and somewhere outside the wind shifted and came around from the north, and the second wave of the cold stretch began to settle over Greycreek. Wesley left at midnight. He took the brass ring with him. He had not unwrapped it. He had decided sometime during the second hour at the table that he would carry it for a while longer before he tried to set it down. The next Sunday was the first Sunday of December. The congregation filled the small frame chapel. Hattie sat in the back pew again beside Mabel Crowder this time because Mabel had walked up to her on the steps and had taken her arm without asking and had said only, "We're sitting together today." Marshal Daniel Aldridge stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hand. Old Ned Pritchard had not come to a service in 11 years and had not come to this one either, but he was at the smithy across the road and his door was open. Reverend Hollister Pike preached for 50 minutes about pride. He did not look at Hattie this time. He preached at the rafters. He preached at the windows. He preached at the unpainted boards of the back wall. He spoke about the sin of believing one's own hands knew more than the hands of one's elders. He spoke about the danger of new ways. He did not name Hattie. He did not need to. When the service ended, the congregation did not file out at once. The men gathered at the chapel door, and the women lingered in the aisle, and the air in the room thickened, the way the air thickens when something is about to be said. Ezra Whitfield stepped up onto the lowest step of the pulpit. He did not climb to the pulpit itself. He stood one step up where everyone could see him, and he turned to face the room. "Friends," he said, "I will not keep you long." The room went quiet. "This settlement," Ezra said, "has survived 20 winters with wood and iron. My father survived them. Your father survived them. The Reverend's father survived them. We have a way of keeping our families alive in this country, and the way works. Now a widow comes among us, and she does something different, and some of you are beginning to whisper that maybe the old way is wrong. I want to say plainly, the old way is not wrong. The old way is what built this town. I am asking each of you to think hard before you let a stranger's strange building convince you to set aside what your fathers taught you." There was a murmur in the room. A few of the men nodded. One of the women looked down at her lap. Wesley Holcomb stood up. He stood up from the third pew from the front. He did not climb the steps. He stood where he was with his hat in his hand, and he turned halfway so that he was facing both Ezra and the congregation. "Ezra," he said, "my wife died 11 months ago in a room I kept burning all night. I stoked the iron stove every hour. I followed every rule my father taught me. She died anyway. Her hands were cold when she died." He looked around the room. He looked at the women in the aisle. He looked at the men at the door. "I am not going to bury another soul to keep your wood prices alive. Say what you want about the wall. I am building one in the spring." There was a long silence. Mabel Crowder stood up next. She stood up beside Hattie. She did not let go of Hattie's arm. She turned to face the congregation, and her voice, which had soothed laboring women through 10,000 hours of pain, did not shake. "I have midwived in this country for 16 years, Mabel said. "I have seen babies come into this world in cabins where the cold killed them inside of a week. I have buried more children than I have delivered in some winters. If a wall of stone keeps a soul warm through a January night, I do not care what the Reverend has to say about the natural order of things. I want stone." The murmur in the room grew louder. It was at that moment that old Ned Pritchard came in through the back door of the chapel. He had crossed the road from the smithy. He still had his leather apron on. His hands were black with the soot of the morning fire he had been tending while the service went on. He walked up the center aisle slowly because his knees had been bad for a decade, and he stopped at the front just below the steps where Ezra was still standing. "Pritchard," Reverend Pike said. He had finally found his voice. "You are interrupting a discussion of grave importance." "I know it," old Ned said. "I came in to be part of it." He turned to face the congregation. He had not spoken in this chapel in 19 years. The room had gone perfectly still. "My father," old Ned said, "built a wall like the Brennan widows in Vermont in 1819. I was 9 years old. I helped him haul the stone. He died 11 years after that, and the man who bought the farm tore the wall out for an iron stove. My father was not a heretic. He was not building outside any natural order. He was a man who had lost 2 children to the cold and had decided after the second one that he was going to try something different. He turned to look at Reverend Pike. His voice did not rise. Reverend, the natural order is a man keeping his family alive, nothing else. If a wall of stone does that work better than what we have, then it is the new natural order, and the old one was just what we had until we knew better. Reverend Pike opened his mouth. He closed it. He turned away from the pulpit. He walked down the steps and out the side door of the chapel without saying another word. Ezra Whitfield was still standing on the lowest step. He looked at old Ned. He looked at Wesley. He looked at Mabel. He looked at the back pew where Hattie Brennan was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, watching him without expression. He stepped down from the step. He put his hat back on his head. He walked out the front door of the chapel with his son Toby trailing 3 paces behind him, and the door swung shut behind them, and the congregation was left in the room without any voice to follow. That night in the Whitfield cabin, Ezra Whitfield took his son by the shoulders. He took him by the shoulders in the small back room where Toby slept, and he closed the door behind them, and he did not let go. "You're going to watch her," Ezra said. His voice was low. His hands were tight. "You're going to find a way to be useful to her. You're going to be at her cabin every other day, helping her with the wood, helping her with the water. Find out what she's hiding. Find something we can use against her. Anything." "Pa," Toby's voice was small. "She's not hiding anything. She's just building a wall." Ezra's grip on his son's shoulders tightened. "We lose this winter, boy, we lose the farm. Your sisters will not eat. Your mother will not eat. Do you understand me?" Toby nodded. He had to nod. He had no other answer he was allowed to give. His father let go of him. His father walked out of the room and shut the door behind him, and Toby stood in the dark for a long time before he sat down on the edge of his straw mattress. He cried very quietly into his sleeve so that his sisters in the loft would not hear him. He went to Hattie's cabin 3 days later. He carried a small bundle of dry kindling under his arm because it was the only excuse he could think of. He knocked at her door. She opened it. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had looked at him in October, when he had felt the horsehair in the mortar without being told what it was, and then she stepped aside and let him in. He set the kindling beside the firebox. He stood up. He looked at the floor. "Boy," Hattie said. He looked up. "Your father sent you," she said. "I know. Sit down. Eat something." He sat down at the pine table. His face had gone red. His eyes had begun to fill with the kind of tears a boy of 14 cannot stop and does not know what to do with. Hattie put a piece of bread and a piece of dried venison on a small wooden plate and set it in front of him. She did not say anything else. She went back to her work at the wall. He ate. He chewed slowly. After a while, he set the bread down and he said without looking up, "My ma was always cold." Hattie did not turn around. "Even in summer," Toby said. "She wore a shawl in July. I never understood it. Pa said she was just thin-blooded, but she was always cold." Hattie laid one more stone in the small repair she was working on in the upper course. She did not turn around. "Then your ma knew what cold really was," she said. Toby finished his food. He sat at the table for another quarter of an hour. He did not ask any questions. Hattie did not give him any answers. When he stood up to leave, he carried his empty plate to the basin and rinsed it the way he had been taught at home. At the door, he stopped and he turned back to her and he said very quietly, "I am not going to find anything for him to use against you, ma'am. I want you to know that." "I know it, Toby. I am still going to come, though, because my sisters—" "I know that, too." He left. He walked back across the snow in the gathering dusk, and at the edge of the Whitfield property, he stopped at the smithy of old Ned Pritchard. Old Ned was banking the forge for the night. The coals were low and red. He looked up when the boy came in, and he did not seem surprised. Whitfield. Mr. Pritchard. Old Ned set down his tongs. He walked over to a small workbench against the back wall, and from a drawer he took out something that had been sitting there for almost a week. It was a small iron hook hand forged about the length of a finger with a careful flattened end the size of a thumbnail. He carried it back to the boy. "Take this." Toby took it. He turned it in his palm. The iron was cool and very smooth. The workmanship was the kind that comes out of a lifetime of doing the same craft at a small scale the way some old men know how to do. "What is it for?" "It is for hanging a small thing on a wall," old Ned said, "or for catching a small thing that is falling, or for marking a place. You will find a use for it when the time comes." He looked at the boy. His pewter beard caught the red light of the coals. "When the time comes that you have to choose, Tobias, you choose like a man. Not like your father's son. There is a difference. Do you know what it is?" Toby looked at the iron hook in his palm. He did not know what to say. "A father's son does what his father tells him," old Ned said. "A man does what is right. Sometimes those two things are the same. This winter they will not be. Keep the hook. You will know what it is for when you know." He turned back to the forge. He banked the last of the coals. He did not look at the boy again, and Toby walked out of the smithy with the iron hook in his pocket, and he did not show it to his father, and he did not put it on the wall, and he did not show it to anyone for the next 8 weeks. In the second week of December, Wesley Holcomb began to haul stone. He did not ask Hattie's permission. He did not announce it. He went down to the creek at sunup with a wooden sledge and a heavy iron bar, and he pulled out the same flat shelf stones she had pulled out 3 months before. He dragged them back to his own cabin. He stacked them along the north side of his barn at first, because he had not yet decided whether to build the wall against the barn or against the cabin. He stood in the snow at sunset and turned the stones the way old Ned had turned them at her stone pile in September. He chose the flat ones. He set the round ones aside. Marshal Daniel Aldridge came up the road on the third day. He did not say anything. He took off his coat and laid it across the saddle of his horse, and he walked over to the creek with Wesley, and he picked up one end of the sledge rope. The two men hauled stone together for the rest of the afternoon. They worked in silence. They had each lost too much in the last decade to need to fill an afternoon with talk. At the end of the third day, when the light was going purple on the snow, Marshal Aldridge stopped at the edge of the woodpile and looked at Wesley across the load. "You're building this for Adelaide, aren't you?" Wesley did not answer at first. He wiped his face on the back of his sleeve. He looked at the stone they had just unloaded. "I am building it," he said, "so I can sleep again." Marshal Aldridge nodded once. He picked his coat up from the saddle. He shook the snow off it. He swung up onto his horse and rode back toward town, and Wesley stood alone in the dusk beside his stones, and for the first time in 14 months, he was tired in the way a man is tired when his work has not been wasted. On the night of the 23rd of December, Hattie Brennan went into Greycreek to buy flour. The trip took most of the afternoon. The roads were packed but slow. She left her cabin at 1 in the afternoon, and she was not back until almost 5. The light was already failing when she came up the path with her sack of flour over her shoulder. She knew before she opened the door that something had been done. The latch was not quite seated. The boot prints in the snow at the threshold were not hers. She set the flour sack down in the yard. She drew the small knife she carried in her apron, more out of habit than purpose, and she pushed the door open with her free hand. The wall was still standing. The wall was still standing, but in the upper course on the north side, 3 stones had been levered out and dropped on the floor. The pine panel of the alcove had been wrenched off one of its iron hinges and lay tilted against the wall. The mortar around the displaced stones had been cracked badly. It would take her 2 days to repair. And the oak trunk in the corner of the cabin was open. The leather apron had been thrown aside. The chisels had been scattered. And the notebook, the brittle leather-bound notebook, with Silas Brennan's hand on every page, was gone. She stood in the doorway with the knife still in her hand. She did not weep. She had not wept for the loss of any object since 1870. But she stood very still for a long time, and her hand on the knife was white at the knuckles, and her breath came slow and even and cold. She knew who. She did not need to ask anyone. She did not need a witness. She knew the way a woman knows when she has been robbed by someone she has already been robbed by once before with words in his own front yard. She did not go that night. She closed the door. She set the flour on the table. She knelt at the firebox and she built the small fire and she let it burn for its 3 hours. She slept with the broken pine panel propped against the alcove frame because it would no longer close. She slept badly. She slept anyway. On Christmas morning, she walked 2 miles south through the snow to the Whitfield cabin. She did not knock loud. She tapped twice. The door opened. Ezra stood on the other side. He was in his shirt sleeves. He had not expected her. His face went through 3 different colors in 2 seconds before it settled. Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Whitfield. She did not step inside. She did not raise her voice. She stood on his porch with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she looked him in the face and she said only this: "I don't need the book back. I have it here." She tapped her own temple once with her gloved finger. But the boy saw something, and the boy will live with what he saw whether you give it back or not. She turned away from his door. She walked back across the yard. She did not look back. Inside the cabin in the small back room, Tobias Whitfield was standing pressed against the partition wall with his hand over his mouth. He had heard every word. He had also seen what his father had done with the notebook the night before. He had watched from the loft window. Ezra had carried it out behind the woodshed in the snow. He had built a small hot fire in a tin pail, and he had fed the pages of the notebook into the fire one by one. He had stood there for almost half an hour until the leather cover blackened and curled and finally collapsed into the coals. When Ezra had gone back inside, Toby had climbed down from the loft. He had crossed the yard in his stocking feet. He had picked through the ash in the tin pail with the iron hook old Ned Pritchard had given him 8 weeks before. He had found 1 page intact. The fire had not been hot enough to consume the last page. The page had fallen against the cold tin and had stopped burning at the edge. The corners were brown. The center was whole. Toby had pulled it out of the ash with the iron hook, and he had carried it back into the cabin, pressed inside his shirt, and he had folded it twice and hidden it in his pillowcase. He had not read it. He had not unfolded it past the first crease. He had only seen the top of the sketch. Now on Christmas morning, with his father standing at the closed front door, with his hand still on the latch and his back to the boy, Toby slid down the partition wall and sat on the floor of the small back room, and he held the folded page through the cloth of his pillowcase, and he understood in the way a 14-year-old boy understands things he has not yet found words for. That something had been taken that was not coming back, and that he was carrying the only piece of it that had survived, and that he would not give it up until he knew where to give it. He held it for the next 5 weeks. He held it through the new year. He held it through the second snow of January and the third. He held it through his father's longer silences at supper, and through his mother's worried glances across the table, and through the increasingly sharp arguments he heard at night between the partition walls about money and about wood and about the slow, steady loss of customers at the back lot of the general store. 3 families that had been buying from Ezra Whitfield in October had not bought from him in December. 2 more were waiting on the thaw to begin hauling their own stone. He held the page through all of it. He did not show it to anyone. On the 30th of January, 1874, the temperature at sunset was already at 15 below zero. The sky to the north was the flat gray that meant only one thing in this country. By 8 in the evening, the wind had begun to come straight down out of British territory with nothing in front of it to slow it, and by midnight, the thermometer outside the general store had cracked at 38 below, and every man and woman in Greycreek who had lived through the winter of '68 knew that the storm had come back. In the Whitfield cabin, Tobias Whitfield lay fully dressed under his quilt and listened to the house settle against the wind. He had been waiting. A mile away, Marshal Daniel Aldridge stood at the window and did not sleep. He had not slept since 10 o'clock. He was thinking about the cabins and the wood piles and the men who would stoke too long and the women who would stay too late, and somewhere in the back of his mind, without yet having put it into words, he was thinking about the Whitfield place and about a boy he had watched grow up across 2 summers, and about the way Ezra had stopped coming into town for 3 full weeks. He sat down on the bench by the door. He pulled on his boots. Outside, the wind began to scream. The blizzard of January 30th, 1874 came down out of the north in a single hour. There had been a flat gray sky at dusk and a hush across the prairie, and then the wind arrived the way a hand arrives across a face. By 8 o'clock, the temperature had fallen to 20 below. By 10, it was 30. By midnight, the thermometer outside the general store had cracked at 38 below zero, and the storekeeper had given up reading it and gone home to his family with his coat over his head. In the Whitfield cabin 3 miles south of Hattie Brennan's land, Tobias Whitfield lay on his straw mattress and listened to the house settle against the wind. His 2 younger sisters were curled together under quilts in the loft, and his mother had banked the iron stove a second time before going to bed. His father, Ezra, had gone to bed early the way Ezra had been going to bed early for the past 3 weeks, ever since the morning Hattie Brennan had stood on his porch and said the words that had not left him since. The boy will live with what he saw, whether you give it back or not. Toby had not slept a full night since Christmas. He had lain in the dark with the torn page hidden in his pillowcase, and he had listened to his father move through the rooms of the cabin like a man pacing the floor of a debt he could not pay. He had watched his father stop pretending to eat. He had watched his father stop laughing at anything his sister said. Tonight, Toby was fully dressed under his quilt. He had been waiting. He waited until he heard his father's breathing fall into the slow, heavy rhythm of the second sleep. He waited until his mother's lamp went dark across the partition. He sat up. He pulled on his second pair of wool socks. He pulled the page from the pillowcase and folded it into the inner pocket of his coat. He moved across the floor in his stocking feet and lifted his boots from beside the stove and carried them to the door. He laced them outside on the step in the wind, with his hands going numb inside the first minute. He did not have a lantern. He did not need one. The snow gave back enough light to see the road, and he knew the road, and he knew the way north. A mile away in his own cabin, Marshal Daniel Aldridge stood at the window and did not sleep. He had not slept since 10 o'clock. He was 55 years old, and he had seen this kind of wind twice before in 20 years of riding this country, and both times men had died in it. He stood at the glass with his fingers laced behind his back, and he watched the snow come horizontal across his yard, and he thought about every cabin in the settlement, and which ones had wood, and which ones had thin walls, and which ones had men who would stoke too long, and women who would stoke too late. He thought about the Whitfield place. He thought about the way Ezra had stopped coming into town for the past 3 weeks. He thought about the boy. He sat down on the bench by the door. He pulled on his boots. Hattie Brennan was already awake. She had been awake since the wind shifted at 11:30. She had stoked the firebox a second time, which she had not done in 5 months. She had used dry oak split very fine, and she had let it burn hot for 2 more hours. The wall had taken the heat the way it always took it. The cabin held. The wind tried the door once hard, and the door held, and Hattie sat at the pine table in her wool dress with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. And she waited because she had learned in the last month that on nights like this, someone always came. The knock at the door was not a knock. It was the sound a body makes when it falls against wood. Hattie was up before she had fully decided to stand. She pulled the door open against the pressure of the wind, and Toby Whitfield collapsed into her arms. He was conscious. He was not frostbitten, not yet, but his face was the color of skim milk, and his lips were beginning to turn the gray that comes before the blue. She did not speak. She kicked the door shut behind him with the heel of her boot, and she carried him across the room, and she opened the pine panel of the alcove with one hand while she held him up with the other. She laid him inside the wall. She pulled the wool blanket up to his chin. She closed the panel almost all the way, leaving the small gap at the bottom for air. Then she stood back and waited. Inside the alcove, Toby's breathing slowed. The shivering, which had been violent when she carried him in, began to ease within 4 minutes. Within 10 minutes, his color had begun to come back. The wall did its work the way the wall always did its work, and the boy slept, and Hattie pulled a stool over and sat beside the closed panel and watched the floor. A few minutes after she sat down, she heard him speak through the wood. "Ma'am," he said, "I have a piece of it." She did not understand at first. "He didn't mean to break it," the boy said. "He was just scared." Then she understood, and she put her hand flat against the pine panel, and she said nothing, and the boy slept again, and the wind outside the cabin found nothing to take from her. The second knock came at midnight. This one was a real knock, 3 raps, the strike of a man's knuckle through a glove. Hattie rose from the stool and crossed the room and opened the door. Wesley Holcomb stood on the step. His coat was half-buttoned. His beard was full of ice. The wind had scraped his cheeks raw, and his eyes were too bright. "My stove cracked," he said. She stepped aside. He stepped in. He saw the closed pine panel and the small stool beside it, and he understood the situation inside of 2 seconds without a word being said. He did not ask. He turned toward the firebox. Hattie crossed to the wood pile in the corner. She lifted 3 pieces of split oak. Wesley took them from her hands. He knelt at the firebox and he laid the wood in the way he had watched her lay it back in November. Smaller pieces at the base, larger pieces angled across them. He used her flint. The fire caught on the 3rd strike. The flame drew the way the flame always drew here, pulled inward and upward through the long path inside the wall, and Wesley stayed kneeling and watched it for almost a minute, and Hattie stood behind him with her arms folded across her chest. When he stood up, he did not turn to her. He spoke at the wall. "He's in there." "Yes." "He alone." "Yes." Wesley nodded once. He walked to the table and pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. He did not take off his hood. He laid both hands flat on the table the way a man lays his hands flat when he is trying to keep them from shaking. Hattie poured him a cup of coffee from the kettle on the trivet. She set it in front of him. She did not sit down. "Sleep on the floor by the wall, Wes," she said. "The stone will reach you." He looked up at her. There was something in his face she had not seen there before. It was not gratitude and it was not sorrow. It was the look of a man who had been carrying a stone of his own for 14 months and had just set it down. "All right," he said. He laid himself out on the packed earth floor, with his back against the warm limestone, and within 5 minutes his breathing had gone slow, and within 10 minutes he was asleep. Hattie put more wood on the fire. Then she sat down at the table with her cold coffee, and she waited for the third thing. The third thing did not come in the form of a knock. It came in the form of dawn. The wind eased a little after 4 in the morning. By 5, it had dropped to a hard, steady gust, and by 6, the first gray light was beginning to push at the edges of the eastern sky. Hattie had not slept. She had let the fire die at 2. Toby had not stirred in the alcove. Wesley had not moved on the floor. She rose from the table and pulled on her coat and her boots and her shawl, and she stepped outside to look at the morning. The settlement was buried. Snow had drifted to the eaves on the north sides of every cabin she could see. A horse stood in the Caleb Morrow yard with its head down, alive but unsheltered, and Hattie was already calculating how long that horse would last in the open when she saw the figure coming up the road. It was Marshal Daniel Aldridge. He was on foot. He was leading no horse. His coat was crusted with snow from his shoulders to his boots, and there was a darker stain across the front of it that he had not yet wiped off. He walked the way a man walks when he has passed the point of being tired and has entered the country beyond it. He stopped at her gate. "Brennan," he said. She walked out to meet him. She did not ask. She waited. "Ezra Whitfield is dead," the marshal said. She did not speak. "I found him 800 yards from his own back door. He had a pile of his own firewood with him. He was trying to carry it." Marshal Aldridge looked up at the gray sky and then back at her, and his face was very tired and very calm. "He was looking for the boy, Hattie. He must have gone to the boy's bed an hour after the boy left. He went out into the wind with no lantern and the wrong gloves. He made it nearly to the road. He could not carry the wood any further." Hattie put one hand on the gatepost. The wood was cold under her bare palm. "He spoke," the marshal said. "Before he went, he said, 'Tell the boy I went looking.'" She closed her eyes. She did not weep. She had not wept for Silas in 7 years, and she did not weep for Ezra Whitfield now, because the weeping she had in her was for someone else, and she had not yet earned the right to it. "Is the boy here?" the marshal asked. "He's in the wall." The marshal nodded slowly. He did not ask her to explain that sentence because he had been to her cabin enough times in the last 6 weeks that he no longer needed an explanation. He took off his hat. He held it against his chest. "I'll tell him," he said. "No," Hattie said. "I'll wake him. You tell him." She turned and walked back to the cabin, and the marshal followed her. And inside, Wesley Holcomb was sitting up on the floor with his back still against the wall, his eyes already open as if he had heard the conversation through the door. He did not ask. He stood. He moved aside. Hattie knelt at the pine panel. She tapped it twice with her knuckle. "Toby," she said. The panel opened from inside. The boy sat up blinking. His face had gotten its color back. He looked at her, and then he looked past her at the marshal standing in the middle of the room with his hat against his chest, and his face changed in the way that a boy's face changes when he learns before any words are said that his father is dead. Marshal Daniel Aldridge stepped forward. He knelt down so that his face was level with the boy's. He laid his hand on the boy's shoulder. He did not speak first. When he did speak, it was quietly the way a man speaks at the edge of a grave. "Your father went looking for you, son," he said. "He didn't make it back, but he went looking." Toby did not cry in front of the marshal. He did not cry in front of Hattie. He did not cry in front of Wesley. He pulled the wool blanket up to his face, and he turned his head against the back of the alcove, and he reached out one hand and pulled the pine panel shut from inside. The 3 adults stood in the room and listened. Through the wood of the panel, through the body of the wall, they heard the sound a 14-year-old boy makes when he has just learned that his father was not, and after all, the man he had been afraid of, but only a frightened man who had run out into a storm with the wrong gloves to find him. It was not a loud sound, it did not last long, but it was the sound of one specific kind of grief. The grief of a son who has just been forgiven by his father in death for not having forgiven him in life. And the three adults in the room did not look at each other because they each had their own version of that grief stored somewhere, and they did not trust their faces to keep it. Hattie laid her palm flat against the closed pine panel. "He's all right, Marshall," she said, "or he will be. The wall is patient." The funeral was held 3 days later. The snow had been packed by men with shovels into a path from the road to the small frame chapel. Reverend Hollister Pike conducted the service. His voice was not the voice it had been in October. He did not speak about the natural order of a home. He spoke about a man named Ezra Whitfield who had loved his children and who had been afraid for them and who had gone out into the worst wind in 20 years to find one of them and bring him home. He did not speak about the wall. He did not speak about Hattie Brennan. He did not look at the back pew where Hattie sat beside Mabel Crowder, where Toby sat between his mother and his youngest sister, where Wesley Holcomb sat one row ahead with his hat in his lap. After the service, the congregation filed out into the cold sunlight. The men gathered at the door to shake hands with Ezra's widow. The Reverend stood beside her and did his work. When the line had thinned and only a few people were left in the yard, Reverend Pike walked away from the chapel and crossed the road and went down the lane to the blacksmith shop. Old Ned Pritchard was at the forge. He was not working. He was sitting on the bench by the cold anvil with a mug of coffee in his hands, the kind of mug he had not offered to a churchman in 19 years. He looked up when the Reverend came in. He did not stand. Reverend Hyde took off his hat. He stood in the doorway of the forge with the gray January light at his back, and he did not seem to know how to begin. "Pritchard," he said. Old Ned set down his mug. He stood up slowly because his knees had been bad for a decade. He walked over to the small iron pot that he kept warm on the edge of the forge. He poured a second mug of coffee. He carried it back across the dirt floor, and he held it out, and Reverend Hollister Pike took it the way a man takes a thing he has not earned and does not know how to refuse. The two old men sat down on the bench together. They did not look at each other. "I buried Ezra Whitfield this morning," the Reverend said. "I know it. I will bury more before this winter ends." "I know that too." Reverend Pike turned the mug in his hands. He looked at the coals in the forge banked low for the day. "My father was a Methodist circuit rider," he said. "He rode for 30 years in Indiana. He never had a hearth of stone. He never knew any man who did. He raised me on the natural order of things." Old Ned nodded once. He did not speak. He understood that this was the closest the Reverend would come to an apology in this life, and that pressing him for more would only undo what was being done. "My father said it took him 20 years to admit what he didn't know," Old Ned said at last. "You've done it in one winter, Reverend. That's not nothing." Reverend Hyde drank his coffee. He did not finish it. He set the half-empty mug on the bench between them. "Thank you, Ned. Don't mention it. Don't mention it to anybody else either." Reverend Hyde almost smiled. He stood. He put his hat back on his head. He walked out into the cold sunlight, and Old Ned watched him go, and then Old Ned picked up the half-empty mug and drank the rest of it himself because some kinds of communion are not improved by being shared. In the second week of March, the ground began to soften. There was still snow on the north sides of the cabins, still ice along the banks of the creek, but the days were getting longer and the wind was losing the killing edge it had carried through January and February. The settlement began to come out of itself the way a settlement always comes out of itself in March. Children were sent for water without being wrapped in 3 coats. Women stood in their yards and beat the winter dust out of their rugs. Men walked the lines of their fences, and counted what the wind had taken. And 7 of those men, without any of them having spoken to the others about it, began to haul stone. They came from the same creek bed Hattie had used. They came at different hours of different days. Caleb Morrow began first. Wesley Holcomb, who had finished his own wall in February using the heat from Hattie's wall as a shelter while his cabin was unusable, began the second wall, this one against the north side of his barn. Marshal Daniel Aldridge began the third. Old Ned Pritchard, who had not laid stone since he was 19 years old, and his father had still been alive to teach him, began the fourth, the last, and the slowest, but the one with the cleanest courses because his hands remembered. By the first week of April, there were stones piled behind 7 cabins in Greycreek. By the second week, 3 of those walls had risen above waist height. Hattie Brennan did not visit a single one of them. She did not teach. She did not advise. She worked her own claim, split her wood, tended the small winter garden in crates she had kept alive by the southern window. She loaded her firebox at 6 each evening. She let the fire die at 9. She slept in the alcove. She rose at dawn. But on Sundays, Mabel Crowder began to bring the women. Mabel did not announce it. She simply walked over from her own cabin on the first Sunday in April with 2 women in tow, and they sat in Hattie's yard and watched Hattie mix mortar in the wooden trough, and Hattie did not stop them, and she did not speak to them, and she did not explain what she was doing with her hands. The next Sunday there were 5 women. The Sunday after that there were 9. Mabel sat on the overturned crate she had sat on in October, and she did not say anything either. She had figured out somewhere along the way that the wall could not be taught by talking about it. It could only be taught by being watched. The women watched. They went home. They mixed mortar in their own troughs. They worked the horsehair in with their hands because their husbands had brought home the horsehair from the manes of the workhorses, because their husbands had been told by other husbands that the horsehair was what made the wall hold. The information moved through the settlement the way information moves when it does not pass through anyone's mouth in particular. The wall was not a sermon, the wall was a practice. By the end of April, the practice had spread to 7 cabins. By the end of May to 12. It was in the 3rd week of April that Toby Whitfield came up the road alone. He was still 14. He had grown half an inch in the 8 weeks since his father's funeral. He carried in the inner pocket of his coat the folded page he had carried since Christmas. He had not given it to Hattie on the night of the blizzard. He had meant to. He had been ready to. But when he had said the words, "I have a piece of it," through the closed pine panel, she had not opened the panel to take it, and he had understood somehow that the page was not yet ready to be given. He walked up to the cabin and he knocked. Hattie opened the door. She let him in without a word. He sat down at the pine table. He pulled the folded page from his coat. He laid it flat on the table between them. The paper had been folded and refolded so many times in the last 4 months that the creases had begun to split. "He burned the book, ma'am," Toby said, "the night you came to the door. He took it out behind the woodshed and he burned it in a tin pail. I watched him from the loft window. After he went inside, I went out and I picked through the ash. This was the only page left whole. The fire had gone out before it got to this one." Hattie did not pick up the page. She looked at it on the table. "Have you read it?" "No, ma'am." "Why not?" Toby did not answer for a long moment. He looked at his hands, which had grown larger in 8 weeks, the way a boy's hands grow when grief makes him useful. "It wasn't mine to read." Hattie looked at him. Then she looked at the page. She unfolded it. The paper inside was the last page of the notebook. The ink was Silas Brennan's, the looping, careful hand of a young man who had believed he would have time. The page bore a final sketch smaller than the others of a stone wall with an alcove cut into it, and underneath the sketch were 3 lines of writing. "Hattie, If I cannot build this for you, build it for yourself. Stone remembers what fire forgets. I love you in every wall we never raised. She read it once. She read it twice. She read it a third time. Then she folded the page along the same creases the boy had folded it along, and she walked to the small wooden box she kept on the bench by the firebox, and she opened the box, and she laid the page inside, and she closed the box. She did not weep. She did not need to. She had wept for Silas in another country, in another life, and what she had now was not the weeping. What she had now was the wall. She turned back to Toby. Your father saved more than you know, son, she said, the night he ran out. Toby looked up at her. He did not understand. He waited for her to say more. She did not say more. She walked to the iron pot on the trivet, and she poured him a cup of coffee. She set it in front of him. She sat down on the bench across the table from him, and she watched him drink it, and she did not speak again until he had finished. You'll come back on Sundays, she said, if your mother will spare you. There's work I can use a good pair of hands for. Toby nodded. He stood up. He set the empty cup on the table. At the door, he stopped, and he turned back to her. Ma'am? Yes. What did you mean that he saved more than I knew? Hattie did not look up from the table. You'll understand it, she said, but not from me, from the wall. He left. He walked back down the road toward the Whitfield cabin where his mother was waiting and his two sisters were waiting, and the place his father used to sit at the table was waiting, and he carried with him the new weight of a sentence he did not understand. He carried it for the next 3 months. By the time the leaves were fully out on the cottonwoods along the creek, he had begun to suspect what she had meant. And by the time the first snow fell again in the November of 1874, he knew. He knew because his mother and his two sisters were sleeping inside a wall that he and Marshall Aldridge and Wesley Holcomb had built for them along the eastern side of their cabin in October, using the stone from the creek and the mortar with horsehair worked in, and the small firebox in the center, and the alcove cut 60 inches long along the inner face. He knew because his father had died trying to bring him heat in the form he understood, and the heat that had been waiting for him all along had been a different kind, the kind that did not need to be carried, the kind that lived inside the stone after the fire was gone. His father had run out into a storm with cordwood in his arms. His father had not known there was another way. The boy he had run out for had learned the other way, and the learning had passed through the boy's hands, and now the boy's mother and sisters slept warm. That was what Hattie Brennan had meant. That was what his father had saved without ever having known he saved it. In late April of 1874, on a Tuesday afternoon when the wind had finally come around from the south and the prairie was beginning to show the first green at the roots of the dead grass, Wesley Holcomb came up the road to Hattie's cabin with something in his hand. He stopped at the door. He did not knock. He waited the way a man waits when he has been thinking about a moment for several weeks and does not want to spend it on the wrong sentence. Hattie opened the door. She had seen him from the window. Wes, Hattie. He stepped inside. He did not sit down. He laid on the pine table a small object wrapped in a soft cloth. He unwrapped it. It was a brass ring, very plain, slightly bent at one edge from many years of work. Adelaide's, he said. She wore it on a chain when she was working in the garden, so it wouldn't get caught. Hattie looked at the ring. She did not touch it. I'm not asking for anything, Wesley said. I want you to understand that first. I'm not waiting for you. I'm not building towards something. I've already buried my wife and you've already buried your husband, and neither of us is the kind to mistake a wall for a marriage. Hattie almost smiled. She did not let it reach her mouth. But if you ever need a man to stand beside you at the next funeral in this town, Wesley said, I'll be there. That's all I came to say. He stepped back from the table. He waited. Hattie reached out. She put her hand on the brass ring. She felt the small, bent edge under her fingertip. She thought about Adelaide Holcomb, whom she had never met, whose hand had been cold at 4 in the morning, in a room a husband had kept burning all night. She thought about Silas Brennan, who had drawn the sketch of this wall in a notebook in another state in another year. She thought about Ezra Whitfield, who had died 800 yards from his own back door with his arms full of the wrong answer. She pushed the ring back across the table toward Wesley. "Keep it, Wes," she said. "She earned it, so have you." He picked it up. He did not say anything. He nodded once. He folded the cloth around the ring and put it back into his coat pocket. He walked to the door. At the door he stopped and turned, and Hattie thought for a moment he was going to say one more thing, but he did not. He touched the brim of his hat. He went out. She closed the door behind him. She stood for a long moment with her hand on the door. Then she walked back to the small wooden box on the bench by the firebox, and she opened the box and she looked at the folded page from Silas's notebook, and she closed the box and she went back to her work. The years passed. The settlement of Greycreek became a town. The town of Greycreek elected a mayor in 1881, built a school in 1884, replaced the small frame chapel with a brick church in 1889. Iron furnaces eventually replaced wood stoves in most of the houses. Glass windows painted boards brick chimneys, a railroad spur in 1896. The original cabins were torn down one by one as the families that owned them prospered enough to build larger homes on the same lots. Hattie Brennan's cabin was not torn down. It stood at the northern edge of what had once been the original claim, surrounded now by larger houses with painted siding and second stories. The old limestone wall did not crack. It did not sag. The mortar held. The chimney drew clean. On the coldest nights when the town lights dimmed and the wind still ran wild across the prairie, the small cabin held its warmth without noise, without smoke, without struggle. Hattie did not marry again. Wesley Holcomb did not marry again either. They lived a half-mile apart for 31 years. He came to her cabin twice a week for coffee on Sundays and Wednesdays. She walked to his cabin every Friday afternoon to help him with the garden. They were known in the town as two people who had each been widowed before they arrived and who had each found in the other something that did not require a name. Marshal Daniel Aldridge retired in 1888. He died in 1893 of pneumonia in his own cabin with Mabel Crowder at his bedside because Mabel had at some point in those years become his companion as well, in the same quiet way Wesley had become Hattie's. He was buried beside his brother on the 80 acres Hattie had bought from the land office in 1873. Hattie gave the land for the grave. She did not ask anyone's permission. No one asked her to. Reverend Hollister Pike died in 1885. Old Ned Pritchard outlived him by 9 years. Toby Whitfield, who had become a blacksmith under Old Ned's instruction and inherited the forge, married a girl from the next county over and had 4 children of his own. He named his second son Ezra. He named his first son Silas. He did not explain the names to the boys until they were old enough to ask. In the autumn of 1904, when Hattie Brennan was 73 years old, a young man in a pressed coat came to her door with a notebook of his own. He had come from the city of Bismarck. He was 24 years old. He worked for an architectural journal that had heard rumors of a building technique in the older towns of the territory, a stone wall construction that retained heat through the night without the constant feeding of a fire. He had been told that the original wall in Greycreek still stood and that the woman who had built it still lived in the cabin that contained it. He removed his hat at her door. He explained his errand. He asked politely if he might have an interview. Hattie looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped aside and let him in. She did not give him an interview. She did not answer his questions. She walked him over to the eastern wall of the cabin, and she took his hand the way she had taken Toby's hand on a March afternoon 30 years before, and she pressed his palm flat against the limestone. The stone gave its warmth back into his skin. Fire heats fast, Hattie said. Air cools faster, stone remembers. The young man wrote it down. He looked up from his notebook. Ma'am, he said, who taught you to build this? Hattie did not look at him. She looked at the wall. He did, she said, and he is still here. The young man did not understand. He went back to Bismarck. He wrote his article. He used the sentence. The sentence was reprinted in architectural journals for the next 50 years and was eventually quoted in a textbook of vernacular American building practices and was eventually carved into a small bronze plaque that was set into the foundation of the cabin in 1957 when the Greycreek Historical Society bought the property and made it a museum. The plaque is still there, the wall is still there, the alcove is still there, the pine panel on its iron hinges is the original panel. The mortar with horsehair worked in is the original mortar. On the inner face of the alcove, near where the head of a sleeping person would rest, there are two lines of writing carved into the limestone in two different hands. The first line was carved in the spring of 1874 by Wesley Holcomb with a chisel borrowed from old Ned Pritchard while Hattie was at the creek hauling more stone. It reads, "For Silas, and for Adelaide, and for everyone the cold took." The second line was carved in 1890 by Tobias Whitfield Blacksmith, age 30. It reads, "For Pa, who went looking." Hattie Brennan never spoke of either line. She lived in the cabin until the spring of 1908. She died in her sleep inside the alcove with the pine panel closed on a night when the wall was still warm from a fire that had been out for 11 hours. She was 77 years old. Wesley Holcomb found her in the morning. He sat on the small stool beside the closed panel for a long time before he opened it. He did not weep. He had finished weeping in 1872, the way she had finished weeping in 1870, and what was left between them did not need any more of it. He laid his hand flat against the stone above the alcove. The stone was warm. "All right, Hattie," he said. "All right." Outside, the wind moved across the prairie, the way it had moved for 10,000 years before any wall was raised against it. But the cabin held its warmth the way it had held it on the night of the blizzard, and the way it had held it on the night two men knocked at the door, and the way it would hold it for another 150 years after the woman who built it had stopped feeding the fire. The fire's job had never been to fight the night. The fire's job had been to prepare for it. And the wall, which had been mocked in October and feared in December and built by 7 men in the spring, remembered everything the fire had given it and gave it back slow and patient and without asking for anything on every cold night that came after. That was the work. That was all of it. That was the work.